Okay, so new 302. This is Odyssey Part 3. You probably saw that from the title. Okay, so we left off talking about the Bag of Winds and Aeolus. And now we're coming in towards the Lystrogonians, the cannibals. Okay, again, I recognize I'm going to have to pick this up a little bit to fit it all inside an hour. So with that in mind. Okay, key features that we need to consider about the Lystrogonians. They're cannibals. Thing one. Cannibalism, obviously something of a theme here. Now, properly speaking, we might think that the Cyclops is not a cannibal, right? Because he's not human, and therefore, right, it's humans eating humans is cannibalism. But nevertheless, he's an intelligent, devouring principle, right? He talks, he has language, even though he's not civilized, he's not a man, but he has those qualities. It has a cannibalistic kind of quality to it, right? The Lystrogonians, likewise, are cannibals. What's cannibalism? Well, cannibalism is within sort of the general principle of men. It's a principle that human devouring human, right? It's again sort of parasitic in a self-involved kind of way, right? Cannibalizing, right? Eating oneself, right? Within this sense. So here we have sort of more shadow principles, right? Driven by consumptive gluttony, right? Driven by the desire to consume onto themselves. And we have the Lystrogonians, right? They're cannibals. And what do? They break up the ships. Now, we already discussed the ships, in this sense, of course, are conveyance. They're the way through. No ships, no getting through the chaos. If you don't have a ship, right, or you can't get a ship, you are not fording your way through the sea. And so again, there's a stripping away that goes on here, right? There are some figures who are sort of allied to the ego and working mostly in tandem with the ego. And then there are other parts that likewise have this quality and they converge, and it's cannibalistic, but also they break up the ships. There's this stripping away and the stripping down of Ulysses' ego. More and more and more is being taken. It's being taken away. It's being taken away, right? All of the accumulated prestige and manpower and resources and food, right, that have been given are being stripped away. Okay. And then we have Circe. Okay. So next up, Circe. Circe is a witch. What does that mean? Well, I mean, it means she's something of a sorceress, right? She's a woman who possesses magic. She is sort of functionally, it seems, immortal, right? Possesses certain kinds of divine power and so on and so forth, but she's a sorceress. And this particular kind of sorcery is transformative, right? This tells us something too. Again, we're getting this image. So what happens? She transforms through, again, wine, right? Enchanted wine. So again, there's a sense of like indulging in some sense. And what happens? The men are transformed into pigs, right? So this transformative property, she's alluring. It's another confrontation with the feminine, right? Where the feminine has a certain kind of danger to it. Now, in Jung's reading of the feminine and the anima, this is a not uncommon feature, right? That often it is the case that sort of the masculine archetype is sort of dominating, right? It's sort of dominating. It's about force and tyranny, right? And, intellect wielded in a weaponized fashion and like overpowering and control and, right? This is how the animus typically shows up, right? And can show up in that fashion, of course, for men, not technically as an animus in core feature, but the point is it imposes itself, right? The tyrannical king kind of thing. And it can sort of impose itself, right, on the female psyche similarly, right, in the form of the animus. But where the anima goes off, it has this seductive property and this transformative property, right? You think about this historically a little bit and like, what does it mean to be a witchy woman? A lot of attention has been given, over time to sort of like witch hunts, right? when we think about the Salem witch hunts or the witch craze around the Malleus Maleficatorum, right in sort of the upper Middle Ages, the early pre-modern period, and we see, you know, that periodically there's these outbursts, and they have rightly, I think, in some cases, been characterized as being sort of anti-feminist, right? I mean, not feminist, of course, in the modern sense per se, but like very often, right, these witch hunts were an opportunity to start denouncing, right? Start denouncing people, calling them out, using the sort of forces of like indignation and mob panic and mob justice, right, to eliminate people. And of course, these sorts of things get wildly out of control, as they generally do. This is not a new human property. But one of the things that often gets singled out in the witch hunt, of course, are people that don't quite fit in. And people that don't quite fit in most human societies, if they're functioning, take on a somewhat magical kind of role. Being a witchy woman is about having a certain kind of power that doesn't seem to be easily contained, right? Having a mystery and so on and so forth that can't easily be controlled, right? It's the same thing for being sort of in the position of wizardry, and there's a reason that, you know, wizardry is often frankly persecuted too, right? Being part of the magical infrastructure is something that, you know, sets you at odds often with people. If it's shamanic, then it's well integrated. People understand that you serve a role. And the fact that you can't hunt probably on your own is okay, because what you can do is heal and talk to spirits and leave your body and get omens and do all that stuff, right? But that role for the sorceress is often more fraught, especially in sort of patriarchal societies. And the society of the Greeks was extremely patriarchal. So we have this feminine figure who is witchy. You know, I refer you back to in Marwenkoll, Dejah Thoris, right? Dejah Thoris, who's named after a character from the Barsoom novels, right? A Princess of Mars and the John Carter books. You know, is a figure that is slightly set apart. It's supernatural, right? She moves through time, right? She's a time machine, so she is not subject to the usual flow of events. She has the magical power to out of existence. She's dangerous. She's dangerous, right? But simultaneously, you know, alluring. She has a lot of like sort of sex appeal around her. That's a frequent property of sorceress figures. And Jung talks about at some length the anima type, right? Which is a certain type of woman who, you know, sort of often through sort of a degree of cool flatness or something, tends to invite projections. And there are such women. Most people will find that there are easy to access instances where people are projecting onto them in a really powerful way. Like if you reflect on this, you'll find it. And this is certainly true. There is, you know, for many women, right? And certainly for a subset of women, they get projected upon. I knew somebody, I dated somebody who would get this kind of projection in an extremely literal way. It was quite striking. She would be literally compared to sort of sirens. So in one case, a fellow who she had dated fairly briefly, who visited us when we lived in India, like had literally compared her to a siren singing him to his doom, right? This is a direct Odyssey reference, basically. But like, think about that for a second. What does that mean? She's a cold, cruel seductress who lives in the sea, right? And it's like her song seems beautiful, but her beauty is deceptive and dangerous, right? That is the quality that often gets projected onto the so-called, you know, the anima type woman, right? Who receives these kinds of projections. She wasn't actually a sea creature. She wasn't actually singing anyone to their doom. This was an emotional reaction experience that he was having. Basically, that he was saying, like, I find your beauty attractive, but also it destroys me, right? So very projective in that sense. So we see in Circe this kind of figure, but she's very much in possession of her power. She's dangerous and alluring, but also she possesses the power to transform. And that transformation comes in the form of intoxication, which then leads to a kind of intoxicated debasement. The men become pigs, right? Men become pigs. Now, in our culture, of course, obviously, like pig carries a bunch of different connotations, right? So, you know, it carries police by weird extension, and there's some things like that. But generally, right, to say that somebody is a pig, right, it means that they are uncouth, that they do not have manners, that they're kind of like gross, right? They wallow, they're unable to constrain their appetites, right? That often, in fact, it means that they're sort of, like sexually forward, right? So that guy's a pig, right? Well, what does that mean? It means that he's sort of not controlling himself behind, whatever, like civilized presentation, right? He's not being gentlemanly, right? Rather than being a gentleman, he's being a pig. And a pig means he's indulging in his appetites in some way, and right, being really like forward about it and kind of crass about it. This is unfair to pigs. Pigs are highly intelligent, thoughtful creatures. They sing to their young, and they're quite smart, considerably smarter than dogs. One of my exes kept a pig. They raised a pig on there when they had a little hobby farm. And, they told me about it, and she was like, they were raising a pig, and the pig was quite aggressive. And eventually what she had to do, call back to Rat Park here, what she had to do, she realized the pig was aggressive because primarily it was bored. So she built all of these like manipulable, she enriched its environment, right? Toys and games and, like things that it could play with and manipulate and operate, because pigs are quite curious. They lead with their nose, but their nose is like a thing that they can dig with and a thing that they can smell with. They live in a quite rich and social world, pigs. Not, unfortunately, the way that we raise pigs these days. And this is not going to turn into a sermon or a lesson on factory farming. I do eat pork, something that I feel, frankly, morally conflicted about. It's delicious. So in that sense, I'm not completely free from my appetites, nor am I, morally stainless. But like pigs and factory farms don't have good lives. I don't think I need to tell anybody that. It doesn't take very much research to determine this fact. And anyway, this pig, I think, had a pretty good life, such as it is. And, of course, obviously, if you don't condone carnivory in this sense, then the whole thing is immoral. But if, obviously you have sort of a moral scale that you're willing to apply this to, the fact that she enriched this pig and gave it lots of food sources and lots of space and toys and stuff, and then later killed and ate it, seems sort of marginally better in some sense. I don't know. That's a complicated one. Complicated for me and not totally resolved. So in any event, the point is that the cultural association that we have with pigs is that they're sort of dirty, crass, given to their appetites, a bit gross. So the fact that she changes them into pigs is like, right, again, we have these instincts and motivations that are not totally aligned with the ego, with Odysseus, and they are sort of dragged down to base appetites. Now, Odysseus himself is protected because he gets the leg up from Hermes, right? The messenger and trickster god tips him off again, and tips him off to the sort of magic repelling power of a particular herb, moly, right? Moly, from which incidentally we derive the expression "holy moly," right? If you've ever heard like "holy moly" as a kind of vaguely sort of out of date and like a childhood pre-swearing expression, like "gee whiz," or "gosh," or whatever, right? If you've heard "holy moly," that's what this is, holy moly. And moly in this sense is like an herb that reflects magic. It's a bit of an invocation, although of course we've all lost track of that, or most of us have. So he's got moly, and so he repels the magic. Now, what happens here is, of course, his men become pigs, and he is not captured in this, but you'll see again that his motivation is sapped in some sense. Not completely, but it's sapped in some sense, right? The forward motion is arrested. He spends time on this island, and he spends time as Circe's lover. Like, this is one of a number of these instances. She wants him to stay, right? Like many of these cases, there's like the offer of sort of supernatural immortality. You don't have to go. You can stay. Stay with me, the sorceress. Forget your wife. Stay with me, the sorceress, right? There is this powerful lure to that, right? To sort of remain in a godlike state and, with the sorceress at your side. And note that this is another encounter with a kind of femininity, right? The female is encountered over and over and over again in a variety of dangerous forms. But in this form, once the transformative aspect of being dragged down to this animalistic state is repelled, then it's the state of relationship with it that gradually transforms it. And transforms it in such a way as that it turns out, of course, that Circe has sort of the instructions on the next stage of the journey home, the next leg. Once it has been established that he's not staying in that space, right, it points the way forward, right? The men are transformed back, as I recall. Men are transformed back, and so they are sort of not devoured in the way that they have been up to this point, and it points the way forward. Where do you have to go? Well, you have to go here across the ocean, and then right head to the land of the dead. But there's a 1 year gap. Like there's a year here where really there's a kind of an indulgence sitting in it, and we see, you know, Odysseus essentially speaking is entertaining a mistress at great length. And of course, obviously, there are some reasons why we are inclined to say, well, like, you know, we didn't really have a choice. It's like, didn't he? Didn't he? He encounters this figure who is not Penelope. And yeah, in encountering a different form of the feminine, he's gradually integrating. She becomes more on side and sort of conscious. There's a relationship there. But he also is taking on certain properties and eventually is like, no, I need to go home, right? There is a draining out of the appetite in some sense that is driving this heroic, right? More glory, more whatever, right? And instead she's, you know, after a year, unveils the next leg of the journey. So what's the next leg of the journey? Next leg of the journey after a year is, right, sail west, land of the dead. Now, I already mentioned that for the Greeks, the land of the dead, Hades, is not a place of flames and torture in quite the same way. It's a cold realm. It's a cold and bloodless realm, right? It's static, cold, still, quiet, sad. It's like an infinite depth of melancholy. Now, you consider for a second what this means psychologically. And, you know, there's a lot of different sort of stages to something, for instance, like depression. I often try to distinguish when I'm talking to clients, and have had to distinguish in myself, what these different aspects are, right? There's a very active form of depression where one is sort of actively coming at oneself, right? Saying things like parts of one's mind are attacking one, you know, you're a failure, you suck, right, etc. And there can be like an acute sadness, right, an acute grief that seizes you when you're in that kind of state. It can be tempestuous and horrible. You feel trapped in your own life, trapped in your own being, and right. But there is also a form of depression that is this kind of stillness. I pointed out on a number of occasions that I have recognized that one of the sort of gateway markers for me of a certain kind of depression is boredom, right? When I'm experiencing boredom, when my energy begins to retreat in that way, and it's like I can't seem to invest my energy in any direction. Nothing interests me. My projects don't interest me. It's on the cusp of everything seeming meaningless. And when things seem meaningless, it can sink into a cold, dark, immobile place. There's no blood anymore, no passion, right? That's Hades. That's the land of the dead. That once you reach there, there's no more blood, no more passion, nothing to fight for, nothing to do, nothing to change. It's a horrible place, right? Horrible place to be. Now, it's also a necessary place to be sometimes. And I think boredom has a utility that the modern world has not given enough credence to. We have taken enormous pains to make sure that we are never bored. We exist in what Hermann Hesse called the age of feuilleton, right? The sort of the age of distraction, the age of frittery. Right? There's always something to unbore us, always, constantly. And we sort of engage in that way. But being bored is often actually pre-creative. It's sort of incubational, right? The energy sits, and then finally something captures our attention. Being bored, right? Boredom is to some extent the mother of invention, right? Of course, it's been said, right, that, you know, in invention, what's the core expression? This is the mother of invention. Anyway, I often think that boredom and laziness are actually the mothers of invention, right? Invention is like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. But also there's the like, what am I going to do, right? And sometimes that leads to creative places that you don't expect. Boredom is exceptionally creatively useful. And we sort of give it short shrift. So here we are, and we're proceeding to the sort of port, the western port of the land of the dead, and which is, of course, in the west, where the sun sets. And we get a sense of how crap it is, essentially speaking, how cold and dark and lifeless and bloodless it is, because Achilles tells us so, right? He'd rather be a slave in the living world than a hero in this world. There's sort of no point to it, right? It's cautionary. Now, this also, of course, is a reflection. It's like, right, the quick and the dead. And the quick is the land where we do things. This is the field of action, but it's limited. And eventually, we're going to not do things. It's like there's a procession, right? Eventually, we die. And so that refocuses things considerably. When we're in our youth, it seems like there's effectively an infinite amount of time ahead of us. But then when you get that crux middle point and you start to realize that, like, oh, the Western horizon is coming up rather more quickly than I expected, right? We're halfway there. That refocusing and the recognition, it's like, right, the time to act is now. That's a powerful kind of recognition to have, right? That, oh, this is the field of action. I've got one life to live. That can show itself in relatively crass, like YOLO, right? You only live once. Carpe diem. And it is, of course, possible in that condition to be seized with beer commercial reality, right? With a like, I'm just going to do pleasure all the time, hedonism, right? And we all recognize, I think, that that needs to be tempered at some level. It's fine to live in the moment and indulge pleasure, but you also have to think across the arc, because it's like, yes, eat, drink, and be merry, or tomorrow you may die. But odds are you're not going to die tomorrow, and you probably are going to have to pay your rent. So how do you balance those things out? It's easy to fall onto the Hamlet side of the equation, endlessly thinking, never engaging, the Protestant hell, right? It's always Monday and never Saturday, right? Never Christmas. So there is something that has to be balanced here. And I've talked about this before too, because, a brush with death, as it were, is one of these conditions where you'd think this would be ultimately clarifying, and it is not. And I've discussed that at some length with regard to certainty. So having this brush, though, is that recognition. It's precisely that. It's like, oh, right, one life, right? This is my life. And after this, like Achilles, the greatest hero, is like, I would rather be a slave. I would rather be in the field of action than here. This is a call, of course, to action, and it demands that you clarify that action. But who else do we encounter here? Well, we get, a trip from Odysseus's mother, and this lets him know, right, time is ticking. It's a more female encounter, time is ticking, but she also refocuses him. She's like, prioritization, home, your wife, your kid. Like, this is actually the field of your legacy, right? So there's a refocusing there. And then, of course, we get Tiresias. And Tiresias is, again, he's an interesting, he, she, they. It's an interesting categorical figure. It's intercategorical, rather, an interesting intercategorical figure. Tiresias is, of course, the blind sage, but also is, in a very important way, a mystic hermaphrodite. And that hermaphroditic quality and that supernatural visual quality, right, is marched out in front of us in a number of ways. The fact is that Tiresias is blind, and Tiresias is blind because they have serovision. They can see the future, right? But also Tiresias, plants their staff between two serpents. This is, of course, somewhat a reference to the staff of Mercury, right? Entwined serpents around the staff, right? So plants the staff between two serpents and takes on, Hermes in this case, takes on the hermetic power. Hermes himself, right, has that quality, that mercurial quality. It moves, it shifts, right? And so there's that shift. Tiresias, of course, is also the figure on record for seriously pissing off the female Greek goddesses, because at one point there's an argument going on about whose pleasure is the greater in sex, right? The man or the woman. And Tiresias, having been both, is the only figure who can answer this question. And so the gods are like, hey, who has more pleasure in bed, the man or the woman, right? And Tiresias answers, oh, the woman by far, right? I forget what it precisely says, but it's like 10 times or something, it's 10 times more pleasurable. And obviously, right, the the Greek goddesses are not super happy with him having spilled the beans about this. So Tiresias is this really interesting figure, intercategorical, right? Very much sort of in the space of Mercurius, the blind seer who nevertheless sees more than mortals can see, has partaken of the male and the female, right? Intercategorical, interstitial, right? Mystical, hermaphroditic. And Tiresias, of course, lays out the course here. And it's like, you know, here's what you have to do, but also the big injunction. And what's the big injunction? Don't eat the sun cows is what we get. Don't eat the sun cows. Again, it's this like consumptive gluttony. We can think about this in terms of inflation, right? You can think about, right, the ego self-axis as per Edinger. And, right, what does it mean to eat the sun cows? Well, what does it mean to eat the sun? To take on the power of the sun, the nutrition of the sun, the flock of the sun, right? It belongs to the sun. Don't eat the sun cows, right? Don't get yourself all inflated. Don't eat the sun cows. Okay. Now, it's worth talking here in general about this scene as a Nikaya. Okay. So there is a necromantic quality to this whole sequence that's quite important. Like, you know, Odysseus rounds the spirit up and he engages in an act of necromancy, right? This act of necromancy, in fact, was so influential over the ancient world that it was quite frequently replicated by people who were sort of looking to speak to the dead. It formed the basis of a lot of actual ritual framework. Dr. John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth in England, was Queen Elizabeth's sort of court astrologer and magician, and also spy master, etc. Fascinating figure. And when he did necromancy, it was with specific reference to this kind of Greek Nikaya. And it's interesting to see the specifics of what happens, right? A trench is dug and it's filled with hot blood. And why? Because it attracts the spirits, right? Because they're attracted to the warmth of the blood. Okay. And then they imbibe the blood, right? And that is what returns them to some measure of sensible, right? Sensible dialogue. What does this mean in psychodynamic terms, right? For our purposes. What's blood? Blood is life. It's heat, it's energy, it's, right? There's a continuity. We say, well, it's in my blood, right? Or we talk about bloodlines as a sort of pre-genetic way of thinking. I often have to impress this. For instance, this is going to sound like an aside, but I often have to impress this upon my my student players when I'm running Dungeons and Dragons for high school students, which is they'll start talking about something and they'll start talking about genetics. And I'm like, no. Like, you're in a fantasy world. This world doesn't have genetics. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, it has blood. Genetics is a modern idea. The idea that you have like tiny double helix spiral molecule things that are inheriting discrete traits and Mendelian pea plants and all that jazz, it's very recent. Rather, the ancient idea is blood. You have a bloodline, right? Your father's blood runs in your veins. Your mother's blood runs in your veins. Blood is this continuity back to the ancient ocean, right? Blood is salty. We have the ocean in our veins, effectively, right? That's what blood is. Blood is life. If you lose enough blood, you are dead, right? So blood is this like invigorating, livening kind of thing, right? A live body has blood. A dead body, you poke it, after a couple of days, it no longer bleeds. Blood is life. So we see blood here as energy, an energetic source, right? It's libido, to borrow this term. And that's a term I don't use a lot, honestly, because it still carries, I think, pretty strongly the Freudian imprint. And so people think of libido as sex energy primarily, right? But rather, we think of it here as sort of psychic energy, but it is the energy of life. So we have these dead parts, right? And what does this mean? The Nikaya, the communion with the dead, is this really powerful theme that you see drive through. And certainly it's very common in Jung, right? The 7 Sermons of the Dead is a kind of Gnostic text that was delivered to Jung by ghosts. And if you read that text, you get this real sense of like, oh, making contact with the dead to sort of communicate within the space of the archetypes and complexes is, of course, insofar as we're talking about the collective unconscious, making contact with things that are not sort of unique to you and contained within you, but inherited. It's in the blood, right? But they're dead. They're old and dead. And the realm of the shadow, likewise, it's these unconscious pieces that are sort of like left behind. They have no life. That's often why they're acting out, right? They want access to life. They want to live. So summoning up, right, spirits in this sense is to summon up, you know, the pale shape, right? To pray that it comes hither, the pale shape, and then to lend it energy to invigorate it. And that's a thing that you see in practical terms, right? When you're doing sort of depth psychological parts work, right? Is that often you need to sort of lend your life energy to a piece of yourself to give it voice, give it expression. Often that's what it wants. And if you won't do it, it will make attempts to try to get that from you. It'll manipulate you. In strong cases, it'll sort of step right in and take over in various ways. But if you sort of dig the trench, right, create a barrier, but also fill it with life so that you can speak over that trench, then you can begin to have communication. It becomes sensible. You can see here a thing that I've been talking about a lot, which is that you're not looking necessarily to like absorb and dominate or banish these aspects of yourself. You're looking to give them what they need to lend them voice, to lend them expression, to lend them life, to lend them blood, so that, right, you can form a different kind of relationship. And then they begin to respond consciously and sensibly to you. You begin to be able to have like a reasonable relationship where they tell the ego what they need to do. And in this case, Tiresias is very clear. Very clear. Don't eat the sun cows, right? So, of course, Odysseus gets this message. Sorry, actually, wait, one more thing. Just talking about this. Jung does draw a distinction, and it's an important one. This is one that was sort of emphasized by a bunch of the post-Jungians too. Hillman talks about it. Edinger talks about it a bit. Von Franz has a few things to say about it. This distinction, okay, between like total underworld descent and night sea journey. And one of the things about this particular form of Nikaya is that it's intentional. Again, it's like the difference between differentiation and disintegration. When things just like fall apart, disintegration, that's not actually an effective engagement. I mean, sometimes it can be helpful, but usually it's not. On the other hand, to deliberately pass into the space is to, right, to drop into the underworld on purpose. And that's the distinction. There is a measure of intentionality and consciousness. It is different to move into the cave under your own power than it is to have the tiger leap on you from the bushes in the rain, right? When you make the approach, it's different. And this is, of course, what one has to do sort of therapeutically and in inner work all the time. You're constantly making approaches to things that terrify you or that you hate or that you're resistant to. And of course, the thing that, you know, you're seeing the resistance around is typically where the work is. And it may not be that you have to sort of accept it or be overwhelmed by it. That's a mistake. But you do have to develop some relationship to it, because the very fact that it's pushing on you in the way that it is emotionally is the sort of sign that it has its own power. So, you know, I spoke with a client the other day. We had an interesting 1-hour session, and they've been working through a bunch of material, of course, obviously. And we had sort of 45 minutes of quite genial material around this. And then we kind of got to the crux of things, and they brought this point up, and I said, well, you know, this is something you've been orbiting a lot, and it seems like this and this and this are of a piece, and this particular relationship is emblematic. These are abstracted versions, right? Metaphysically abstracted. You need to come at this. And their entire tone changed. They became quite intractable and fixed, and they were like, there's no conversation we had there. There's nothing to work out. I already know what the answer is. And you know, as soon as they shifted tones, I was like, I want you to pay attention to how much your energy just changed here, but also, like, stay with me here. Like, I'm not out to get you. I'm trying to point something out to you. They're like, well, I already, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, okay, but like, how is that? Like, is this working for you? Is this where you want to be? And they're like, no, it's horrible. And I said, right. So what I'm telling you is you need to try to make an approach to this. It should come to me, they said. And I was like, yeah, but it's not going to, probably. Like, you have to make an approach to it. I understand. You're like, that's not fair. But the point is, like, you hanging on to this and being like, well, I shouldn't, is causing you a blockage. Like, it's causing you problems. And I'm not saying that that's going to be a silver bullet, and I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but it is well mapped. It's quite possible. And the fact that you're sort of, it's impossible and also I won't do it, it's a set of double impediments. So all that is to say, making that conscious approach is part of it. And the Nikaya is that kind of thing. It's like consciously cutting the trench, filling it with blood, and entering into communion with these unconscious forces to see the way forward. Okay, now, what is the lesson? The lesson is don't eat the sun cows, right? Don't eat the sun cows. Don't be inflated, right? Don't try to capture the solar energy. You see lots of this in Greek myth, right? The classic myth of the sun god Sun who steals the chariot and ends up, like losing control and is destroyed, right? There's lots of this kind of thing. So don't eat the sun cows. Okay, fine. So then we leave. And we have a brief encounter again with the sirens, more sort of feminine energy. But what's this feminine energy? It's like sex danger energy. The sirens are trying to sing them off course. The beautiful sea voices, right? But what is it? It's a devouring presence. This particular sort of feminine relationship as sort of like sexual energy and seduction runs through the text over and over again. And I mean, it speaks to a kind of complexification, right, of Odysseus's relationship to the feminine. As I mentioned, you can see this back with the suitors too, right? The suitors are all hanging around and they all want to have sex with Penelope. I mean, that's what they're hanging around. And Odysseus is still very much in that space. And that like space of sort of sex and seduction in such a powerful and dominating way, not that there's anything wrong with sex or sex energy, right? There isn't. But that particular approach to things as sort of a mode of sexual conquest is quite integral to heroic energy. When I say heroic, I'm qualifying this. I don't mean that it's like a wonderful and great thing. I don't think it's inherently problematic either. I think people should have the sex they want to have as long as everybody is willing. I don't see the big deal. But but the point is, it's like that craving after sex as conquest, sex as acquisition. It's very much part of this like first half of life order of consciousness that Odysseus is in. So once again, we have, sex and danger sex singing over the water, right? Now, Odysseus is reasonably wise to this and he stops up his ears, right? And it's just like, na, 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 right? Keep sailing. And I'm just going to like block this out. He basically attempts to just like bite on his fist and ignore the opportunity, right? And that right there indicates something of a change, right? We feel like almost in an earlier version of the story, Odysseus would have been, hey, free sex, and gone towards it, and then, would have woken up and his men would be being eaten by sirens, right? In this case, the sirens drowned them, is the idea, right? So if they obey the sirens, they will be drowned. And what is it to be drowned, right? To go underwater in the unconscious. So to do this is to be off course and to be again swept up in chaotic unconscious forces. Okay. And then we hit the moment of the twin monsters. Okay. And the twin monsters are Scylla and Charybdis. It's a rock and a hard place, frying pan and a fire. Okay. So Scylla and Charybdis. Now, Scylla and Charybdis is like navigating your way through two differently horrible but horrible things. This, as I've said before, is the essence in some way of drama. Melodrama is about good versus evil, right? Good versus evil is simple. White hats and black hats. Most people can do that pretty easily. That's not where people get hung up. I mean, occasionally, obviously, people talk themselves into doing something which they then will acknowledge they knew was wrong. But typically speaking, it's a good deal more complicated than that, right? Drama is about evil versus evil, choosing between two evils or choosing between two goods, right? Choosing between two goods is hard. And it's a state that people reach very frequently, okay? Where they feel ambivalent in an active sense between two things, not because they love one and hate the other, but because it's confusing and each one offers a certain thing, Do I move away to follow my career, or do I stay close to my friends and family? Moving away would mean, potentially forming a new life and new opportunities. But then what am I losing? I'm losing my friends and family. Ugh, what do I do? Should I stay in the relationship that I'm in, or should I pursue this new relationship with this new person who's maybe not just exciting, which, that's the sirens, but is also like, reaching parts of me and bringing out aspects of me and offering things that maybe my current relationship doesn't. But my relationship has good in it too. So what do I do? Do I follow the new potential, or do I stick with the old potential? It's like, things aren't as on fire in my old relationship. This relationship's exciting, but also like there are real aspects here, and not everybody can meet all of our needs, right? Should I stick with the thing that I've already invested the time in, school, career, whatever, or should I switch to this new possibility that seems to speak to some other aspect of me? These are hard problems, right? Actually difficult problems. And it's hard enough, obviously, to navigate just like, oh my God, this sucks and I want to get away from it. But usually it's the case that when we're looking to escape some aspect of our lives, there are things holding us. If there weren't, we wouldn't stay. And this is, even if they're negative things, even if it's sort of fear, and often it's fear. But, you think about this when you consider, for instance, right, the great and ongoing conundrum of people that stay in abusive relationships. This causes an enormous amount of pain to the people in the relationships, but also to their loved ones, who may repeatedly say, like, I don't get it. Like, you're in an abusive relationship. I don't understand. And people will say things of the form, like, well, if I ever got treated that way, I would walk. But what we actually see on the ground is not that. What we see is a much more confused state. And sometimes that's about fear, and sometimes it's about gaslighting. Like, sometimes people are manipulated, but a lot of the time it's the case that it is mixed. It's not simple. Figuring and sorting it out and prioritizing it is not simple. People stay in situations where other people are like, I don't get it. But there are reasons that they're doing it, emotional reasons, whatever. And like sorting those things out, sometimes it's a matter of overcoming certain kinds of like, biases and fixations, right? But a lot of the time it's just not that simple. And pretending that it is that simple, pretending that it's like, yeah, you know what to do. It's like, no, you don't. A lot of the time you don't. And if you think about these states of ambivalence for yourself, that's still in Charybdis. You've got to navigate your way somehow between these things to find your way forward. And like, right? That's navigating between two goods. Never mind navigating between two evils, right? The other side of drama, in which fundamentally, you think about this, and there are situations where it's like, crap, every one of my options sucks. Now, in most situations where you're navigating between two goods, that's the flip side of the problem. I hate no matter what. And I've mentioned before that I think that the fundamental task in many ways of, people navigating through their 20s is you have to start working out your parental material. You probably started as a teen, but you haven't gotten that far, I almost guarantee you. So you have to start working out your parental material. You have to start working out the nature of your relationship, and you have to start working out the nature of your career. But all of that stuff hinges fundamentally on trying to convert potential into actuality while respecting the capital P in potential. You've been trading on potential your whole life. Potential is all kids have. It's what you get praised on, so much potential. But of course, this creates an inflation state that nothing can measure up to if you were supposed to be some super amazing thing. And all the possibilities that stem from your potential, eventually you're going to have to choose. You have to choose a direction. You might be pretty good. You might juggle a bunch of things, but no matter what, there are some potentials that must be sacrificed for you to move forward. That's how it is. If you just stay in the potential state, you don't go anywhere. There's no cumulative or time-bound results to potential. You have to turn it into actuality. And it seems like a cheap trick when you do, right? And no matter what, you grieve. You grieve for all the things you could have been. You grieve for all these aspects of yourself, and you can reclaim that. That's a big part of what shadow work is about. You can go back and pull out aspects that you threw away that you didn't need to throw away, but not all of them. It's bottomless. You can't ever have it all, right? So choosing to navigate between two evils is very much that sense. It's like, no matter what I pick, I get hurt. And that is a central feature of life, right? No matter what I pick, I get hurt. This is a quality. Now I get good things maybe too, but like, no matter what, I'm going to get hurt. Recognizing that that there is no path that carries no pain, is, I think, a fundamental part of sort of maturation, and a fundamental part of overcoming the heroic ethos of happily ever after. So the passage between Scylla and Charybdis is a very interesting one, right? We have, on one hand, Scylla, which is this like six-headed monster, and it stands in for this voraciousness. And on the other, Charybdis, which is a dark whirlpool sucking things down. And so it's like, you got to steer between them, but you also have to make a choice. Are you going to be devoured by a six-headed monster, or are you going to be sucked down into chaos? And so there's a choice here. And you steer a little closer to Scylla, and the six heads eat six men. And again, it's like there's a depletion, right? This is my hand puppets. Okay, there's a depletion, right? Again, there's this stripping away that's always happening as Odysseus is being sort of reduced down. Okay, so we pass by the Sirens, we pass past Scylla and Charybdis, and then we get to the Sun Cows. And then we get to the Sun Cows. And what happens? Odysseus is like, don't eat the cows, and they're working through their reserves, and then the men are like, screw this, and they go hunting and they eat the cows, and this doesn't work out well. Right. There is an interesting moment in here with a fig tree, and time permitting, I'm very interested in the way fig trees turn up in various forms of myth. Fig tree famously turns up also in the New Testament. Fig tree has this sort of funny role. So, the disciples are looking for food, and the whole point of Jesus's followers is they don't work, right? So the disciples are sort of like looking for something to eat, and Jesus is looking for something to eat, and he finds this fig tree, and the fig tree has no figs on it, nothing to eat, and he gets so mad, and he says, "May you never bear figs again." And then the disciples come by like the next day, and the fig tree is like a blasted barren, right? Like it's like he's blasted it with his rage, with his magic powers. It's one of those scenes they don't talk about in church that much, right? You get a pretty sanitized version of Jesus. They almost never really get into depth about him blasting fig trees to death, the woman he flirts with by the well, if you read that passage, flipping tables on merchants, exciting stuff, right? Various relatively controversial things that he says about breaking up existing family ties, right? Which I think you can interpret somewhat metaphorically. His final moment of doubt on the cross, right? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? His doubts in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus Christ in the book, much more interesting figure. Never mind that his core ethos is programmatic homelessness, radical egalitarianism, and a kind of Gnostic approach to direct encounter with God and the kingdom of heaven is within you, all three of which get thrown out in conventional religious formulation, right? The church does good in the world to some extent, and the Pope, it's not an entirely bad guy, I think, but he lives in a house that is a palace, that is a museum, that is a city, that is a country. This is not what you would call like give away everything you own, right? Which is the direct thing. It's certainly not programmatic homelessness. It's highly hierarchical, so it's obviously not radical egalitarianism. And of course, it very obviously is not a direct Gnostic encounter with the divine, because necessarily your encounter with the divine is mediated through priests who are the only people allowed to do sacraments. It's completely upside down. And that's frequently what happens with sort of religious institutional stuff. They become political entities. Anyway, enough about that. So, the point that I'm making here about the fig trees is just fig trees are kind of interesting. They turn up in a bunch of places. And that scene, I've been meaning to write a paper on the fig tree. So we have this brief interlude with the fig tree. And then at last we have Calypso. And Calypso, again, is this feminine figure, but he sort of enters into relationship with Calypso. He falls in love with Calypso, the goddess, and he falls in love and she falls in love with him. And there is a sort of alternate thing where he is deeply humanized. And this is prelude to him finally going home. So he returns to Ithaca, but of course, what does he do? Once again, he forswears the swagger, right, and inflation and walks as a beggar. And the encounters that he has as a beggar are kind of interesting. I mean, there's an echo here of a fairly common practice that you would see in the ancient world, where the king would walk among the people as a beggar, sometimes to their knowledge, where you'd get like an inversion day. That was pretty common in medieval societies, where there was a day where like you'd elevate a peasant king, but the peasant would have to dress like a jester and, you know, sort of be an asshole and whatever. And this was a way of like letting off social steam, right? An inversion of social steam. But you also get this practice of emperors and stuff, for instance, Roman emperors, right? Supposedly dressing up like beggars to move among the people to observe what was being said, right? And it's a little bit spying, but it's also a little bit of humility. It's like to spend a day as a beggar specifically is to take what other people give you and to get a sense of like, well, what's going on here? Are the people kind? This is a reflection to some extent of the quite common, again, ancient idea and powerful among the Greeks that the gods would often take these kinds of forms. Like you should be nice to beggars because they might be a god. They ask for something and they might be a god. That concept of hospitality, right, towards the unknown is like, be hospitable. This is one of the bases of civilization. That's why Odysseus freaks out about it when it happens with the Cyclops. It's like hospitality. And you see this turn up, I mean, again and again and again in the course of sort of the whole course of this story, is that this perception of hospitality and right and the stranger encounter and so on and so forth has this repeated aspect to it. So dressing up like a beggar is forswearing the fact that he is Odysseus, as he would normally be shouting at people. I'm Odysseus, and don't forget it. And instead he walks as a beggar, and he is sort of unknown, right? He moves among, so he moves his servant to, and then listens to what a servant has to say about Odysseus, and he encounters, and there's this gradual kind of building up. And at one point he is abused by the suitors who don't know who he is, right? They're violating this principle. You don't know who you're actually dealing with. You're sort of kicking somebody around in this sense because you don't know who you're dealing with. And then finally, you know, he links back up with Telemachus, and there's a sense that these two parts of the psyche have kind of come together in some important sense. And having done so, then there is the move towards finality, right? There is a re-encounter with Penelope, and again, there is like a testing, right? We have the bow scene where he shoots the bow through 12 axes, and it's like, oh, only a true king, right? Well, he's gone through all this stuff, and so he is a true king. Like, he's ready to come home, but also to be who he's supposed to be, not gallivanting around and, you know, sleeping with sorceresses and slaying monsters and sacking cities, but like to come back and be a responsible ruler over the kingdom, which he's let gone completely to seed, right? And yes, there were forces blowing him around, but also like by times it is his own doing and his own hubris that prevents him from finally returning home. And then we get, of course, the slaying of the suitors. So we got 108 of these guys, and you seal them into a room and then kill them like in the sealed room. And again, sealing, right? Containment. Islands are containment. The Cyclops' cave is containment. We have another containment, right? Containment is very important to the work. You have to have boundaries and containment, but also like, you know, when you're doing therapy, you are creating the temenos, the container in which things happen. You create a space apart as a kind of reactor. So here we have this reactor where these guys are slain. And what are they? These are the parasitic, gluttonous, lustful aspects, so that Odysseus can settle into a mature relationship, right, with his now much more mature wife. It's not that she's a hot sex pot at this point, right? It's been some time. It's that she is an older and more seasoned Penelope, and he is an older, more seasoned Odysseus, ready to settle in and do the work and pass on whatever heroic, you know, energy to Telemachus. Telemachus is now in a position to, right, do his own thing. So I've obviously, you know, collapsed that somewhat. But you can see, again, that there is a certain theme to it. And, right, the setting aside of the persona in becoming the beggar and these various tests of trust and identification, right? This also tells you a little something about doing inner work and encountering forces, because it is often the case that you see in practices around inner figure work and imaginal work that you're sort of running these figures through tests to make sure that they're authentic. I have a client who was sorting out sort of mystical experience and was trying to figure out, like, essentially speaking, like how much of what I'm experiencing is sort of psychosis and how much is coming from God, was something they were trying to work out. And they spoke with a shaman, and I thought the shaman's response was a very interesting one. The shaman said, you know, if you find that the impulse is sort of glorifying God and telling you to love other people and focusing on your relationships and telling you to sing and dance, right? Then that's a divine impulse. And if it's self-aggrandizing, if it's about legacy and conquest and, sort of worldly, setting you off, that's the ego. A pretty clear distinction, right? It's like, right, if it's about a kind of communal approach and singing and dancing and whatever, but if there is this self-aggrandizing, then you're eating the sun cow. So on that note, the Odyssey. Obviously, there is like a wealth of stuff here that we do not have. We have, neither the time nor the space to engage. But I sort of hope that as a tour gives you something to consider and hang on to, in addition to the quite excellent student presentations, right? That covered aspects of that ably, and I'm, trying to sort of bounce off of those things a little bit, and also bounce off the fact that I want you guys to watch Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So that is the material for the Odyssey. So I will see people tomorrow night. I'm going to post these up presently along with Gas Lake and along with a link to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And then I will speak with people tomorrow evening. All right. Hope everybody's having a good week.